Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It shows the Soviet Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the Donetsk region as well as the eastern parts of the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia region in favor of the Russians, with a single advance in favor of the Ukrainians. The Russians have managed to continue their advances in the direction of the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia region. This one is along the second line of defense, where the Russians continue their offensive operations along both the first and second lines of defense. The Russians have also managed to advance in the direction of Kościuszynivka from the south, southeast, and eastern flanks, with additional advances in the northern flank of Siversk and to the northwest of Lyman. The Ukrainians in turn managed to recapture some positions to the west of Pokrovsk. Starting out to the southwest, the Russians continued offensive operations along the second line of defense. Following the capture of Berezove and Novomykolaivka, the Russians have now managed to capture the town of Kalinivske to the west of Novomykolaivka and continue their advances along the fortified positions to the north of Berezove. The Ukrainian second line of defense consists of two portions: the anti-tank ditches and Dragon Teeth lines that is facing in the southern direction, and the fortified positions such as trenches, concrete bunkers, and other fortifications that protect infantry to hold these defensive lines. The objective of the Ukrainians with these fortifications is to prevent a Russian breakthrough through the Ukrainian lines by preventing armored vehicles from driving through the lines, at the same time having these infantry to clean up whatever attempts the Russians make. Now, with the Russians bypassing the anti-tank ditches and Dragon Teeth completely, they're able to make use of the armored vehicles to storm these fortifications, which allows them to have the advantage of armored vehicles while pushing on in the rear of these lines. The entire objective of the Russians attacking from the flanks is mainly to bypass the anti-tank ditches and Dragon Teeth. At the same time, these fortified positions are facing the southern direction. Most of these are next to forest lines, where the infantry can resupply through the forest lines, while having the fortifications to the south of them, manning them to have a clear field of vision towards any upcoming Russian forces. Now that the Russians are flanking from the rear, from behind, and from the sides, the visibility is very poor, and these fortifications cannot be used while having proper vision of Russian forces. This means if the Russians are advancing with an armored vehicle on the Ukrainian fortified positions, they'd have to exit the fortifications themselves to strike back with regular weaponry. Instead, all they can use are drones to prevent the Russian attacks. Other than that, they'll be exposing themselves and lose the advantages of the fortifications. This means the Russians have completely bypassed any advantages the Ukrainians are gaining from these fortifications in exchange for time. And that is why the Russian advances typically end up being slow, because they are sacrificing time for everything else. When something can be done quickly but with more losses, they prioritize doing it slower. And this has allowed them to keep up a sustainable offensive for a long time, which has now expanded to gaining the advantage of attacking from the rear and then now taking control over these fortifications with minimal losses. To the northeast of this, the Ukrainians managed to recapture northern portion of the town of Novomykolaivka, here to the northeast of Moravka, which the Russians just captured. These operations are mainly taking place from the Outflank fortification and the positions of the Ukrainians north of the Solona River. The Russians were geolocated to be striking the northern street with FAB bombs, showing Ukrainian control over the area, but also the bombardment of these positions, as Russians are looking to recapture them to secure the river line, gain control over the outlet formations here near the border area. And here we have an example of some fortified positions the Russians simply cannot bypass. Even if they attack from the rear where there are some forest lines, the Ukrainians still have some fortifications at the rear, and the trench network is formed in an hourglass. This means no matter which direction the Russians are attacking from, they'll be facing these fortifications head on. This is why the Russians have been stuck at these hourglass formations, because instead of storming them directly head on, they are working on outflanking them to cut off the supplies and starve them out. But it is also interesting to see something that is so successful as the hourglass formation, because we can see at every single point in this area where these hourglass formations are built, the Russians have not been able to capture these positions for months. This shows that the Ukrainians really should be building more of these hourglass formations, because taking a closer look at the first and second defensive lines here, there are barely any, if any, of these hourglass formations. I cannot see anyone at a quick glance, and this shows that despite the success of these fortifications, for some reason they've not been building them everywhere. To the northeast, the Russians continue offensive operations, and the Ukrainians likewise to attempt to improve the situation, but there's been no developments over the past 24 hours. As for the Kościanivka direction, there's been several developments. The Russians have managed to advance to the northwest of Alexander-Kalinove, northeast of Yablonivka, along the defensive lines here, storming the fortified positions of the Ukrainians north of the residential area, as they're looking to gain control of the remaining parts of the reservoir, the western flank of the reservoir, to open up the road for offensive operations towards Kościanivka and the settlements here to the west of Kościanivka, Stepanivka, Novye Belka, Roskishne, and Mykolaiv. The Russians have also managed to gain control over several fortified positions, the remaining parts of Katerinivka, and re-entered Klebenbek in a series of offensive operations following the capture of Novosibirsk. The Russians have been able to consolidate their positions and face off against the Ukrainian counterattack. This led to additional offensive operations by the Russians, managing to regain lost positions during the Ukrainian counterattack, and now also gaining control over the road between Novosibirsk and Nilipivka, as well as Pleshivka, getting full control over Nilipivka, and moving on to Pleshivka, where the Russians have bypassed the fortified positions here along the reservoir. And what we can see is that the Ukrainians have not an hourglass shaped, but a square shaped fortification, which again, the Russians are simply bypassing and looking to starve out, rather than storming it head on. To the northeast of this, the Russians have also managed to advance to the south of Oleksandro-Shultine, securing the flanks of the railway area, all the way from Delivka and Donetsk to the south, Kościanivka in the north. To consolidate the positions between Oleksandro-Shultine and Pleshivka and continue advancing along the southern flank to Kościanivka. The Russians have already managed to secure the southeastern flank. They're fighting over Predechina in the north, and now to fight over the remaining portions here along Oleksandro-Shultine, Pleshivka, Ivanopilya, to gain control over the southern and eastern flanks as well, to start the battle over the city itself. The Russians are closer to beginning the siege of the city itself than they are to cutting off the supplies on the northern and southern flanks, because Russian advances have stalled here on the western and northern flanks, with a lack of Russian advances following the capture of Chesev Yar, as the Russians continue to consolidate the positions, build up stockpiles, and build up their forces for offensive operations in the Chesev Yar direction, while on the western flank, it is more because the Ukrainians are launching their counter-offensive operations to the north of Pokrovsk, which is relocating the Russian supplies from the western flank of Kościanivka to that direction to deal with the Ukrainian counterattack operations. Further to the north in the direction of Siversk, the Russians have been geolocated to the north of the town in this small area. It looks like an abandoned warehouse area that has been now captured by the Russian forces. The Ukrainians are striking the Russian positions with FPV drones. As for the situation with the fortified positions along the northern defensive line and the Ukrainian positions within Serbianka, this raises the question as to how solid these positions are. We now have evidence that the Russians are present across the defensive fortifications, which likely indicates that the Ukrainians either have not properly manned or have significant gaps in their fortifications, or that the Russians have gained control over portions of them and continue fighting alongside them. Until the situation becomes clearer, we'll have a large gray zone over the area. As for the northwestern flank of Lyman, the Russians continue offensive operations in the direction of Derilove, where they are storming the settlement from the north. The Russians have managed to gain a foothold in the forest lines and forest patches to the north of Derilove on a wide front. The Russians are likely looking to attack Derilove from the north, as the settlement itself is wide. Attacking from the flanks will have the advantage of a weaker Ukrainian defense. However, if the Ukrainians are lacking in manpower, then the Russians can take advantage by attacking on a wider front. Therefore, the Russians are looking here to gain control over the Derilove and then secure the positions around the settlement to secure for offensive operations beyond it in the direction of Novoselivka, Dobryshev, and so on, by consolidating their positions and connecting the roads from Kolodyasy in the east to Derilove in the west, connecting with their forces. And again, the main logistical hub for the Russian forces here across the Cherevets River line is now Kolodyasy, following the capture of the settlement, and Ternove, which the Ukrainians are looking to recapture both of these positions, targeting them to prevent the Russian build-up of supplies for strong offensive operations moving forward. Ukrainians are here doing all they can to limit the offensive capabilities of the Russian forces by consistently striking their resupply abilities. Throughout the front line, the Russians continue their offensive operations, mainly aiming to cut off the supplies to major logistical hubs of the Ukrainians, while the Ukrainians are trying to cut off logistics to these offensive operations by the Russians. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.